I have sculpted for over 500 hours. So where can 500 plus hours of sculpting get you? If I could do it all over again, what advice would I give myself? If you're a beginner trying to get into character sculpts, it's pretty natural that you dive into this topic with excitement, and then before you know it, you hit a wall, feeling lost and overwhelmed, not knowing how to proceed. If this isn't you, then congrats. If not, welcome aboard, because this is how it went for me. 2013 and 2018, I went to 2 different VFX schools with a passion for filmmaking and VFX. We covered a lot of topics, from filmmaking to 2D motion graphics, and even dabbled in sculpting in ZBrush. So somewhere in some hard drive that is probably corrupted is a scuffed sculpt of Tom Holland's Spider-Man that took one whole module to finish, and was probably my first character sculpt ever. During my time as a student, I started developing a love for 3D and managed to get decent at hard surface modeling in Maya. And my love for cinematography definitely benefited the look development aspect of my works. In 2018, I dabbled with Blender for the very first time, and despite only learning the basics, I was able to get results I felt were not too bad. Then I went on a hiatus for 2 years. 2018 and 2020, I served national service and completely lost touch with 3D. I also dabble in music production, so not having a lot of free time, I decided to focus on producing the beach mouse. So that's literally 2 years of completely not touching any 3D related softwares. Early 2020, I started a YouTube channel where I would make an art piece for every song that I put out. Mid 2020 was when I decided to pick up Blender again and did the 2019 donut tutorial. In this music video I did for a MapleStory cover, this character you're looking at is the first character I've ever created in Blender. However, it wasn't a sculpt, but rather a Frankenstein of poly modeling, assets, and probably some sculpting for the folds of the clothes. This character took over 2 weeks to complete, and it ended up looking like this, so naturally I ditched the idea of creating characters. The second hint of me attempting to get back into character creation was in February 2021, where I had the idea of creating 2D characters over 3D backgrounds. At the time, I did studies without any clear intent, just purely observation, and was very stubborn on developing my own style. It was around March 2021 when I decided to combine everything that I've been doing and start a series. Create a 2D character based on streamers over a 3D background for every song that I put out. All of that eventually led to this. This was, at the time, the most successful content that I've put out ever, but ironically was the last of the series. Why? Because I was burnt out. Not only was it too much work for very little return, but I was just not content with the artistic direction I was heading towards. Keep in mind, this music/art channel was never monetized because the numbers were too low and it never met the criteria. So that was the end of the whole music and art series. In my free time, I continued working on improving my 3D skills, took part in the alternate realities challenge, etc. July 2021 was when I decided to work on an extremely ambitious project. Create an original song and a music video with original characters in it. It's like I refuse to learn. This was my third attempt to get back into character creation. So this character, Jerry, was the first character I've ever sculpted in Blender. I honestly thought that the textures, hair grooming, and rig turned out great, but if you isolate the base mesh, the lack of character fundamentals was suddenly very evident. Before I went too deep into the whole world development rabbit hole, I snapped out of it and realized that it was too ambitious of a project for, again, too little return. Still did the song though, but it was a simple music video with a car and was rendered entirely in Eevee. So I was like, okay, let's stop with the whole character thing now and let's focus on putting out cute shit. My fourth attempt to get back into character creation was in February 2022, where I took an interest in chibi characters. A few fanarts of streamers and video games later, it gradually evolved from chibis to whatever style you wish to call this. And then, surprise surprise, another breaking point. What I had intended to be a stylized version of Henry Cavill playing as Sova from Valorant ended up looking like a Neanderthal variant from another universe. This was probably the biggest slump I have faced as an artist, and to be honest, I had a bit of an identity crisis. A page from my journal literally reads, from 6th April 2022, I'm stressed by the speed of my growth as Disnog. And I also said, to be honest, my motivation is at an all-time low and I do in fact feel like giving up. That's crazy to me that I actually wrote that. So naturally, I took a break. But this break was probably the one I needed the most, as it was the initial spark of the turning point of my art journey. It was during this time where I consumed and got really inspired by Ghibli movies, the works of Poopikat and Luca. I made the hard decision to let go of the alias that I grew very attached to and came came up with a new alias that we now know as Tiny Noki. My 5th attempt to get back into character creation was in July 2022 when I created this fan art of Poopikat's work. In fact, I wrote her an email asking for permission to post them on my socials. Obviously, I'm not going to show you the actual content of the email, but I didn't just leave with a yes. She also left me with some very kind and encouraging words, and you could imagine how gratifying it was to hear them from an artist who you look up to. So all this newfound motivation led to this series of works. That went on for about 7 months, until this very sculpt, where I stepped out of my comfort zone and went for a more real-life proportion. This was when I realized how much I needed to rely on references. Nothing wrong with having references, but I just knew that I wanted to improve on my anatomy knowledge, which was why I did this. I'm about to sculpt 100 heads in Blender. I journal every single day of my Was I an anatomy god by the end of this challenge? No, but the improvement was a sign of hope that this could actually lead to something great. After the challenge, I played around with a few different styles, had a little pause on the journey to work on Tiny Eye 1.3, then I dropped this video where I turned one of your OCs into 3D. While I was working on this video, I was also taking up courses on anatomy to expand my knowledge beyond just heads. And also I was brainstorming ways to not only break the news to you guys, but to find ways to monetize this journey. I mean, your boy's gotta eat, right? Speaking of eating, I just want to take a quick moment to thank my patrons for their support, and a quick shout out to the sponsor tier members of the Patreon, Fox the King, Ruby Lux, and Jason Cuthbertson. So you'll have to wait and see what's coming up next on this channel, but here's what I can tell you. I plan to start streaming on Twitch sometime in July. So having this goal of streaming by mid-2024, I wanted to at least get to a level where it's tolerable to see me sculpt live, and also I wanted to iron out some kinks in my workflow. I had the idea of turning out portraits while doing just that, but it would be a little abrupt from the works that I've been posting so far. So I broke the news before starting this series of sculpt sheets. These are great because they're quick to iterate and they help me identify my weak points quickly. And sculpt after sculpt, I do feel that I'm improving. Here's the sculpt of Taeyeon I did on day 1 of the 100 Heads challenge. Here's the sculpt on the last day of the challenge. And here is where we're at now. Alright, we're all caught up. Here's what I've learned from the 500 plus hours of sculpting. What I'm gonna do first is to get the technical tips and tricks out of the way, and then I'll give some art advice that I feel I would have benefited from when I was a beginner. Okay, technical tips and tricks. Here's what I use to sculpt. I use a Wacom pen tablet, and the pen has 2 buttons. This is assigned to the middle mouse button, and this is assigned to the right mouse button. I hold my pen like this, and my thumb goes over the middle mouse button. So if I want to orbit around the viewport, I just go like this, and if I need to right click, I just go like this. Brushes. Here are all the ones that I use alongside their shortcut keys. Pause the video if you need to. To assign a custom shortcut key, just right click on any one of the brushes or settings, assign shortcut, then type in your desired keybind. Viewport tips. Be sure to use a higher focal length in your viewport when sculpting. I personally use 85mm and wouldn't go below it. I've seen artists go beyond 100mm. This may be a hot take, but once in a while I would hop into orthographic view to check the silhouette of my sculpts. If you have cavity turned on, use world. Screen emphasizes on fine details such as the edges and can distract you from producing clean forms. Matcat Basic 2 is the one that I use the most while sculpting. Some other ones that I use are Matcat Basic 1 and Studio Basic. Flat is useful for observing the color and value of your textures without the influence of light. But you could also do that in the material preview by previewing the textures directly. Speaking of material preview, here are some Eevee tips. If you didn't already know, the material preview uses Eevee. It comes pre-installed with a few HDRI options. My favorite option at the moment is Sunset, but it doesn't hurt to have a few other options. You can preview custom HDRIs and light sources in the material preview by checking Scene World and Scene Lights. Just make sure to turn on contact shadows under the light settings. FYI, this setting is only accessible in Eevee. If you want to use a custom HDRI with a solid background, just follow this setup. Under color management, I use AGX, the improved version of Filmic. It has the ability to handle highly exposed colors to mimic film's natural response to light. I would recommend at least using medium-high contrast. Me personally, I usually go for high or very high contrast. The reason why I avoid using base contrast is because the contrast is a lot closer to the likes of a log profile, which may potentially result in overcompensating of colors and values of materials. Sadly, I couldn't find any manual to back up this claim, but just imagine trying to guess the color and value of this red box in a log profile as compared to guessing them after a Rec 709 conversion. Then when you're done and you wish to color grade in post, turn it back to base contrast before exporting your image. But this works for my workflow, so if your settings don't align with mine and it still works for you, that's completely fine, just stick with it. Make sure that ambient occlusion is turned on and know that the factor goes beyond 1. I like it at 4 for character sculpts. Play around with the distance too, but I usually leave it at the default value at 0.2. Turn on screen space reflections and refractions. Alright, now for some art advice and pointers that I would give myself if I could do this all over again. Keep in mind that everyone has their own ways of learning, and these advice are coming from a self-proclaimed intermediate artist. I may change my mind on these advice in the future, so you have been warned. In the context of learning, art fundamentals are deceptively intertwined. Now, what do I mean by that? Here are all the art fundamentals that I could find. Now let's take a look at this portrait by Poopikat. Which of the many art fundamentals do you think is required to achieve this portrait? In my opinion, I think to be at this level, I'm gonna say that you'll need a tiny bit of anatomy knowledge, a good understanding of color theory and value, shapes, forms, lighting, lines, proportions, and texture. So if that's actually the case, it's safe to say that a course on anatomy or color theory alone isn't necessarily going to get you here, right? It requires not only hours of practice, but a few other fundamentals that are easy to overlook. Now let's assume that each of these art fundamentals are in-game abilities, and there's a wide range of classes to pick from. Right now, you're a beginner, and your class is a digital character sculptor. And for each class, we have 3 advancements: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And let's assume that in order to advance, you have to acquire certain abilities and have them be at a certain level. However, different classes comprise of different abilities. Now let's just say that you've worked really hard and managed to advance to an intermediate digital character sculptor. But along the way, you've decided to change classes and you now want to become a 2D character artist that works with traditional media. The great news is, if both classes share the same abilities, you won't have to learn them again. But with all the new abilities that you have to learn and level up, you shouldn't be surprised if your fundamentals suddenly don't translate. After all, you're technically now considered a beginner 2D character artist, right? So, in the grand scheme of things, art fundamentals intertwine to produce beautiful art pieces like these, but it's a very different story when it comes to learning them, which brings me to my second point. In the large pool of art fundamentals, learn to accept being terrible all over again. We need to set realistic expectations and treat each fundamental as if they are different subjects, because they are. To some of you, this may sound very obvious, but I had the expectation that if I could do this, and this, I would be able to do this in no time. Not true at all. When you're already decent at something and you decide to challenge yourself with a new subject, for instance, you're good at line work but you suddenly suck at shading. It's so easy to think, maybe I was just not made for this. Whereas in reality, maybe you're just not ready to digest a new topic. Or you just gotta push through and learn to be okay with sucking all over again. Embrace being a beginner. Now, point number 3. If I could do it all over again, which fundamentals would I focus on as a beginner? So, considering that we intend to create characters, we should focus on character fundamentals that are transferable in all mediums. Assuming that these are the abilities required to become a digital character sculptor, my recommended build for a beginner in chronological order is forms, shapes, proportions, anatomy. Yes, they all come in hand and are all equally important to learn, but prioritizing certain abilities can lead to more effective growth. Okay, but something's missing. To even cast abilities, you'll need a weapon, aka your tools. If you can't even delete a cube or add a sphere, how would you even think of turning it into a head, right? You don't need to know every single tool in your software of choice, just aim to be comfortable enough to navigate your way around. Before exploring the world, complete the tutorial island first. Once you're done with that, it's time to focus on shapes, forms, and proportions. Let's begin with shapes and forms. Shapes are the external form or the silhouette of something. Based on this silhouette, we all know that this is a circle. Now, if we were to add volume to this circle, we now recognize this as a sphere. That volume is what we call form. So why are forms such a high priority? The thing is, shapes and proportions are more subjective and open for interpretation, but forms not as much. Forms will tell you whether something is inflated, concaved, bumpy, or smooth, and bad forms can destroy a sculpt. Let me demonstrate the importance of good forms. Here's an old sculpt of mine that was done back in 2022. I'm going to ignore all the painfully obvious anatomical errors and only fix the forms. Here it is with bad forms and good forms. I don't know about you, but this now to me feels more like a stylistic choice than a bad practice session. Of course, if we address the anatomical issues, it'll look a lot better, but even anatomically more accurate proportions can't save you from all the bumpy goodness. In this context, I think what causes bad forms besides the lack of practice is uncertainty, usually due to the lack of understanding of what's beneath the skin. Yes, anatomy. But let's put that on hold for now. So what can we do to level up our ability to do forms? 1. We can do exercises such as turning a cube into a sphere. 2. Explore simple organic shapes such as a bean or a stylized rock, and make sure you do everything you can to get rid of bumpy forms. And 3. Look at your sculpts in different angles and observe the contours and silhouette. Since we're sculpting in 3D, it's really important that our sculpt looks good in as many angles as possible. You can observe the contours by making use of the shadows, highlights, and even the polygon edges. Next up, proportions. Proportions are the relationship between parts of a whole. In this context, I'm talking about 2 things. 1. Measurements, using relative scale to measure parts of the body. And 2. Understanding that size is all relative. Let's first talk about measurements. A common trick that artists use is the head-to-body ratio, where they would use the head to figure out the proportions of the body. The 8 heads canon is the idealized standard for adults, but an average adult is usually around 7.5 heads tall. I implore you to check out this video by YanSculpts where you can watch him apply this method. I want to remind you that proportions vary from person to person, so just use this method as a guide, but make sure to adjust according to your references. Also, you might want to check out this free human proportions calculator by Anatomy for Sculptors. Secondly, size is all relative. Take a look at this rock. The size of it is huge, right? It's like a little cliff. Now, if you scale up everything but the rock, it becomes a tiny rock that you could just kick around. Keep in mind that the shape of the rock did not change one bit. Don't confuse size with shapes. This may seem so obvious right now, but let's explore this concept on characters. Now, it's fair to assume that this character has huge eyes, right? But is it because she has tall, rounded eyes? Well, let's scale up the other features but the eyes. Oh, now they look normal. So, no, it's not because she has tall, rounded eyes. Tall and rounded is just the description of the shape of her eyes. So the reason why her eyes appear huge is because of their size relative to the other features, aka proportions. So the next time you do your studies, especially on stylized characters, remember that size is all relative and don't confuse size with shapes. Now, let's talk about learning anatomy. Anatomy is such a complex and extensive topic which even I am still figuring out. But let's just narrow down and talk about the areas I feel beginners should tackle first. Personally, I would start with the skull and bony landmarks. Bony landmarks are the specific points on the skeleton that are most prominent and easily identifiable under the skin. They are a great point of references to ensure correct proportions and shapes. One thing I could have done more often during the 100 Heads challenge would be to study the bony landmarks and cross-reference the shapes and forms of the skull. Remove all the quote-unquote accessories of the head, and you'll soon notice that the top half of our head and the outline of our jaw mostly comprise of bony landmarks. It's an area where I think beginner mistakes are the most apparent, especially at the eye socket region. We have been blessed with this free skull that comes with the Human Base Meshes bundle by Blender Studio, so take that to your advantage. Lower the level of detail and turn off auto smooth. Observe the shapes, forms, and all the plane changes that takes place. Of course, studying the skull alone isn't enough. The next task would then be to understand the relationship between bony areas and the rest of the face, such as the fat pads, facial muscles, and tissues. Honestly, a lot of that can be done by eyeballing the shapes and forms of references while keeping in mind of the bony landmarks. Something I like to do is to set imaginary point A's and point B's, then just fill in the blanks. But as soon as you have the capacity to learn the anatomy of different groups of the face, you should do so. Speaking of imaginary point A's and point B's, a less imaginary equivalent of that are origins and insertions of muscles. Identifying where key muscles originate from and where they insert to will go a long way. Not only does it make filling the blanks easier, but it helps you with guessing the motion of muscles. An additional tip about memorizing anatomy is to associate them with something memorable. For instance, the clavicles are shaped like a hunter's bow, or the term supinated can be associated with soup, as in a waiter holding up a bowl of soup. The pinky finger is used to make the ultimate promise, therefore it's where the ulna is. The thumb is used to gesture really good, therefore it's where the radius is. And the list goes on. Don't be afraid to make up your own shit. Alright, that's all the info I'm going to try to squeeze in this video. I hope that by enlightening you of my little backstory, you remember that your journey is unique, as corny as that may sound, and there's really no point in comparing yours with others. I'm really excited to see how this all turns out. Am I gonna successfully become an advanced character artist, whatever that means, or am I gonna be so bad that I eventually change paths and start twerking for money? Who knows? If you're experienced in this field, do let me know if you agree or disagree with my points in the comment section. I'd really like to know. And if you're thinking about starting your own journey, this is your sign. I'm calling you out right now, okay? Thank you all so much for watching, and watch this video next if you want to see me turn one of your 2D characters into 3D. Bye guys.